Hi, everyone. Welcome to week three. This week, we're getting into something that I think is going to hit close to home for a lot of you all, especially if you've worked and grown up and led here on the border. This week's readings, Chavez, Da Buenca, and Salvela, are all doing something similar, even though they're coming at it from different angles. Each asking what stories get told about people on the border, who tells them, and what happens to real people and real organizations as a result. We can start with Chavez because his concept is one that I want you to hold on to this week. He calls it the Latino threat narrative, and what he's documenting isn't just prejudice or bias. He's making a scholarly argument that over the last 50 years, media representations of Latino and immigrant communities have followed a consistent pattern: invasion, reconquest, and demographic threat. These aren't random. They're a narrative, meaning that they have structure, they repeat, and they shape how people think about who belongs and who doesn't. Now, here's why that matters for this course specifically. If you're leading an organization on the border, and many of you are, your team members, your community partners, your clients, and your stakeholders are living inside that narrative whether they choose to be or not. It shapes what they're willing to say at work. It shapes whether they trust institutional processes. It shapes the risks they're willing to take. You cannot lead effectively in this context if you don't understand the discursive environment your people are operating in. Dabuenka takes it even further. She's writing as someone who has lived on both sides of the border, and she makes a point that I think is crucial for leaders. The narratives about the border don't just come from one direction. There are dominant narratives from the US, but there are also narratives from Mexican intellectuals and politicians that have stigmatized fronterizas as sellouts and culturally impure as people without a real home. And what Dabuenka is showing us is that border leaders often navigate competing narrative pressures, and that the act of leading in this space is already a kind of response to those pressures, whether you're conscious of it or not. And then Zavella comes in with something that I think grounds all of this in the day to day organizational reality. She's examining how structural forces, policy, economics, legal status create what she calls different migrant family formations. She's showing us that people on your team aren't just employees, they're navigating incredibly complex structural realities. The person sitting across from you at a staff meeting might be managing a suspended family, a mixed status household, language barriers at home. These aren't personal problems separate from work. They are the context in which your leadership either creates trust or destroys it. So here's what I want you sitting with as you go into this week's discussion. The scholars we're reading this week all describe environments shaped by powerful narratives that leaders didn't create and can't undo. Given that reality, what does thoughtful, effective leadership communication actually look like in that environment? Not as ideology, but as practice. What do the authors explicitly or implicitly suggest leaders need to understand to operate well here? If you have questions, let me know. We'll see you next week.